Good morning, AP Lit. I actually was trying to post this for you guys a couple days ago, but for some reason it was not letting me upload it. So I'm just going to do another one and hopefully keep this short and sweet. So for this reading assignment, you had three chapters to go through, chapters 8, 9, and 10. And this covers kind of the end of one certain part of the frame story, because by the end of chapter 10, the monster has caught up to Frankenstein, and then it's his chance to tell his story. So even though we're already within a frame story, we're going to enter yet another frame. But before we get there to Victor's kind of pursuit of the monster and kind of this whole little weird cat and mouse game that they're going to play, we have chapter 8, which is Justine's trial. And of course, you know that I love to start this with memes. And one of the benefits of getting to redo this is Maddie sent me this wonderful Frankenstein meme. So hopefully you'll get how this will apply. The reason that I'm going to use this now is to kind of bridge us into chapter 8 is because what I like about this particular meme is that it kind of shows the lack of responsibility that Victor starts to take for his monster and his monster's actions. There's almost an excuse culture that starts to exist for how he rationalizes his way out of taking a stand and doing something to stop this monster and kind of what he's doing to interrupt Victor's life. So, if you remember, previously in the book, Victor returns home with Henry Clerval because he receives a letter that his youngest brother, was killed. They found his body; he'd been strangled, and the only clue as to who could have possibly done this was, of course, the locket that had a picture of his mother in it. And they ended up finding it on a girl who lived with the family, who was a servant, but not in the lowly terms that we usually think of it. So kind of like a nanny, if you will. Chapter 8 is different in tone from the other chapters, on the one hand, because if you remember reading back about Mary Shelley before we started this book, you'll note that she was, as a romantic, there were certain things that she criticized about the society around her. And one of them was a criticism of justice, and not just justice in terms of like the injustices that fell to women in different groups, but also to justice as an institution. So in chapter 8, we see Justine being put on trial for the death of little William. And because of the fate that eventually befalls Justine, it's going to be significant because it's something else to weigh on Victor's conscience. But the way that she is convicted is where we get this kind of social criticism that Mary Shelley puts in. So, bringing us up to speed with chapter 8, where we begin. Like I said, the tone is different here because it's meant to be a social criticism. Now, even though this chapter largely centers around the fate of Justine, what is going to happen to her, I like to think of this chapter as a really good one in terms of characterizing Victor himself. Even though he's not the one at the center of it, you can tell by his language that he puts himself in the center of it. He feels sympathy for himself and how the trial makes him feel, and how what's going to happen to Justine, how that affects him. So, just in the opening paragraph, when they're describing this wretched mockery of justice, there's that social criticism. He says, I suffered a living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings. So, he immediately puts the focus on him. So, his younger brother, William, he knows was probably killed by the demon or the monster that he created. And because of this, he also believes that the monster probably set up Justine. All right. Knowing enough about his family, we could say that the monster, if Frankenstein's thoughts are true, the monster is kind of exacting this mob justice on him. He's not just going after him, which, based on what Victor has seen from him, because of his size and his speed and the way he works, he would be able to catch up with Victor no problem and kill him. But instead, he seems to be going after his family first. Okay. So, he's really focused in this first paragraph on himself. So overall, we get a tone of kind of selfishness on Victor. The fact that this is somebody else's life on the line, but in fact, he has the focus on himself. Another thing I mentioned, that this chapter is kind of highlights the excuses that he makes, the rationalizations for not doing anything, not, getting up and standing in the way. He doesn't go after the monster at first, and he doesn't tell anybody when he returns to Geneva about the monster because he believes that people will think he's mad. So at the end of the first paragraph in chapter 8, in the Skinny book, which is on page 55, he says, 1,000 times would rather I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. So he claims that he will be the one that would rather confess to this, but I'm not going to actually say anything because people would think I'm crazy because I wasn't here at the time. So it's almost like he's rationalizing to make himself feel better. And this is one of the interesting things about getting this first person narration, is that he is able to try and manipulate the storyline, or our perception of it. But a good close reader can kind of see through that here. Another thing that's really interesting about this chapter, chapter 8, is, if you've been keeping track of the motif, that of the female role. So Justine, the one on trial for her life here, she's portrayed as being very calm, not in like a cold, removed way calm, but almost as though she's resigned to her fate. She knows that she does not have a chance here, and because of maybe her station in life as being lower than the Frankenstein family, or even just the fact that she's a woman, it's almost as if she accepts what is going to happen to her while maintaining her innocence. So, in a sense, she starts to come off as almost a martyr, which, based on the previous females that we've seen, Caroline Beaufort, Elizabeth, they're kind of elevated to this saint like role. And we can see that here even with Justine. Okay, I would say if you can kind of note some of the word choices that are used to describe Justine in this chapter, you'll notice a lot of them have to do with heavenly things or angelic things, because she is almost like Mary Shelley showing us through the word choice that she is the innocent here. She's being established as an innocent, which is significant in that the first two people that the monster is going to take away from Frankenstein, they're both innocents. William being a young boy, having had no chance to do any wrong to anybody in his life, and Justine, this girl who is shown to have cared for her own sick mother and Victor's sick mother. So the trial is kind of glossed over. The language that Mary Shelley uses is pretty straightforward in showing that people are, as this group, very much against her. The whole story that we relay, the reason why people think she did it is because she was given leave by Elizabeth, which we don't find out until later, to go and visit an aunt of hers. And by the time she gets back to Geneva, this walled-in little town or city, uh, she hears of what has happened, and she spends hours and hours looking for either the boy or the murderer. And by the time she's done and tries to go home, the gates are locked, so she has to sleep in a barn. And so here is, as the educated reader with the dramatic irony, we kind of know that, okay, it's very possible that when she was sleeping in this barn, the creature could have planted this picture incriminating her in her pocket, because then when she wakes up and goes home, eventually they discover the locket on her. As far as the female role, again, we get the fact that she does speak up for herself. In the middle of page 56, in the Skinny book, basically what she says to the court, rather than, I'm innocent, she just says, God knows how entirely innocent I am. So again, aligning herself of something like above mankind. But I do not pretend that my protestations should acquit me. I rest my innocence on the plain and simple explanation of facts which have been adduced against me, and I hope that the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favorable interpretation, where any circumstance appears doubtful or suspicious. So she basically is relying on her character. She's always been someone that puts others above herself. And in relying on this, she's hoping to appeal to their common sense, but it doesn't. Even for Elizabeth, who feels the need to speak up for her. So again, females, because of how insignificantly this impacts the judges, when both Justine and Elizabeth speak, it shows that they're, lower and less important than others. But Elizabeth does feel the need to speak up. Now, one reason this is important is because obviously it again is showing us what a good person Elizabeth is. But again, it's a contrast to the fact that Victor does not speak up this entire chapter. All of the little things where he talks about how he feels and how he is so agitated and he is so pained, he does not speak up at all. And the fact that Justine can speak for herself and Elizabeth can speak for her, and a man cannot, definitely makes us see Frankenstein as not only selfish but also a coward. Um, so essentially, here's a little example of that selfish nature. Um, my own agitations and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. That's Victor's little kind of summation on the bottom of page 57. But essentially, it is found when he goes to bed and wakes up again in the morning that she's going to be put to death. Justine is condemned. And getting back to this idea of social criticism, he finds out that the reason she's condemned is because she has, in fact, confessed. And when Elizabeth, who's very distraught at this news, that Justine has just said she did kill William, she and Victor go to see Justine, and we get some more of this injustice, this social criticism, because Justine essentially says that she was manipulated, she was coerced into a confession, which is absolutely not true. So she ends up again returning to this idea, this archetype of a martyr, and she dies. And her death is very anticlimactic. At the end of the chapter, and on the morrow Justine died. So there are a lot of chapters that end like this, or not even end, but they have this anticlimactic nature to them. Even Frankenstein, making the monster come alive, it happens in such a way that if you don't read carefully, you can almost miss the fact that he has just brought this creature to life. And that's something that happens here with Justine. And on the morrow Justine died. So again, even though this is kind of a quick little veer off of the path that Victor was on, it seems like maybe a random chapter. I think the important thing about it is that it characterizes him as a coward. When Justine speaks to him right before her death at the top of page 60 in the skinny book, he says, "I could not answer." And so Elizabeth speaks for him. "No, Justine," said Elizabeth, "he is more convinced of your innocence than I was." So again, Victor's lack of a voice shows his cowardice, and the fact that he keeps returning to how he feels with everything shows us that he is selfish because he feels the guilt but will not tell anybody of his actual guilt here. So, a couple things that I would just kind of have you think about with chapter 8. How do we still apply the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner here? So, if Victor is now taking on the role of the Ancient Mariner, what's happening here? Is there a place that you see being parallel in this the story with the poem? And also, I think it's just important to note the change that we're seeing in Victor. And that will bring us to chapter 9. All right, so chapter 9, we can probably go through a little bit quicker. This is more of a transitional chapter. One thing that I would say, just kind of to encourage again your close reading, is to note the shift in syntax at the beginning of chapter 9. So we have this really slow building grief and this whole situation with Justine that unfolds in chapter 8. And as soon as we begin chapter 9, the pace seems to change. It's almost like it gets quicker. The syntax, the sentence structure is a little bit shorter. Just to kind of give you an idea from the first paragraph in chapter 9, "Nothing is more painful to the human mind than after the feelings having been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of an action and certainty which follows and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine died. She rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed my heart, which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit." So we have kind of this pickup of pace. I think it's important again to note that because of our first person narration, the focus begins again on Victor. So after this whole thing has happened, and Victor's not the only one grieving, the focus is entirely on how he feels. Now, an irony of this is, don't forget that he basically gave up on seeing his family for 2 years while he was pursuing science. So for somebody to come back and kind of put on this big show of grief and kind of, you know, pretend to be more upset and inconsolable than his father or of Elizabeth, it's very ironic. So we have again more of the repetition of some of these motifs we're being used to seeing. Victor becomes sick. He says, "This state of mind preyed upon my health." He starts to say he doesn't want to see anybody at all. His dad tries to give him some advice, which is don't dwell in this grief, and almost kind of says, knock it off. He says, "No one could have loved a child more than I loved your brother." And again, I think this is an interesting contrast because the dad is the creator of Victor and his brothers, to Victor's complete and total disregard for his monster. So we see the difference between how a father should feel about his son, and how Victor kind of is mistreating this creation that he had. So at this point in chapter 9, Victor and his family, they leave Geneva, and they go to a house that they have in Bellerive, which is next to this huge mountain. So Bellerive would be in, I believe it's in France. And so there's a lot of discussion of this mountain that they're going to see. And one of the reasons I think that we have this shift in setting is, again, this is a capital R romantic book. And so there's a lot more description of them being outside of society now and being immersed in nature. In fact, on the top of page 63, Victor says, "I was now free." So having these days where he can go out and boat on the lake or go on these long walks, he's completely surrounded by nature. And for someone that is so staunchly, this scientific mind, this is usually something, the natural world that has in the past helped to refresh him when he's sick. But we find that because of, what's on his mind, what he's thinking, it doesn't have that same effect. He contemplates suicide at one point. He says, "I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake that the waters might close over me and my calamities forever." And the only thing that really keeps him from doing so is thinking about Elizabeth and how strong. He uses the word heroic to describe her. The other thing that is causing him a lot of pain is that he doesn't think that this is over. He knows that the monster is kind of seeking him out. And this is causing a plague on a lot of how he's feeling, a lot of his emotions. We also get the sense that his father's health is kind of shaky right now. So we have more of that motif. And another change that eventually, when he starts to talk to other people and listen to them, he talks to Elizabeth and notes the change in her based on what happened to Justine. And one of the things that she brings up comes in the book on page 64, quite at the top. She talks about what she learned basically from Justine's trial. And in the middle of her reflection to Victor, she says, "Men appear to me as monsters, thirsting for each other's blood." And so this is interesting because she is the first one to acknowledge the fact that men or mankind can have a monstrous nature. And so because we see that here, we know that this is going to be something that becomes a little bit more of a comparison later on. As the chapter continues, we see some irony with Victor as far as, the way that he perceives himself. He says William and Justine were assassinated and their murderer escapes. Well, the irony here is that if he's technically the one that created and then abandoned his monster, then he is responsible. And this is where that whole idea of what responsibility does a creator have for his creations come in mind. If you abandoned a child and a child does something terrible, is that on you or is that on the child who doesn't know any better? And so this is something to kind of think about when we start to pass guilt or judge the monster before we really know what he's had to deal with. At the end of this chapter, we kind of take another little kind of side trip, and Victor decides to go on a hike, and there's a lot of description in the last page of Mount Blanc and his journey to kind of climb this peak. So on the one hand, Victor's been speaking in some metaphors during this chapter. Probably the most notable one is on the top of page 65 when he's talking about how sad he is. He compares himself, his analogy is to a wounded deer. He says, "The wounded deer, dragging its fainting limbs to some untrodden brake, there to gaze upon the arrow which had pierced it and to die, was but a type of me." So talking about how he is. And so when we see Victor kind of going on this hike, and as far as how nature is portrayed here, It's beautiful, but it's also, it's a little bit dangerous looking. There's a ravine. He's talking about thunder and glaciers and avalanches and smoke. And so we get a sense that maybe this is also kind of this metaphoric journey that he's traveling uphill or, up mountain to get to. So we have a really detailed description of setting here, which we could say more closely aligns this with romantic literature. And then at the end of the chapter, he goes to sleep, which brings us to our final chapter in this chapter in this section, chapter 10. All right, the final chapter that we have to talk about is chapter 10. And this is the important chapter in terms of Frankenstein and his monster, because since his creation, this is the first time that we have the two back together. So, something worth noting is, again, just being close readers, the beginning of this chapter begins with a lot of discussion of the scenery. And the things are cold, they're frozen, they're ice. So he mentions glaciers, and he mentions accumulating ice. And so when we think about the symbolism of ice is unchanging. It stops things, it freezes them, so that they're kind of preserved in a sense. So I think that's important to note that that's the beginning of how we begin chapter 10. Then, actually, on that first page, the weather begins to change and it gets to be a little bit more foreboding. A mist comes into place, which, usually mist means some kind of confusion. There are clouds that become in place, and it's described as a misty veil. So on this day, Victor's kind of continuing his journey upward towards the top of Mount Blanc. And if you're questioning kind of like, what's he doing? Well, on the one hand, we don't know for sure. We think maybe he could be, just trying to escape into nature. But we also remember that the last time he saw the monster, when they were outside the gates of Geneva, he had headed towards that mountain and begun to climb. So he's searching for the monster here. As he climbs, there's a lot of his kind of thoughts. He's explaining the process of the path that he took up the mountain to Robert Walton in his story. So a lot of description of nature. And then actually we have this interesting break in the narration where we get a portion of Percy Blythe Shelley's Mutability, the poem. Now, Percy Blythe Shelley was Mary Shelley's husband. So on the one hand, you could think, well, she's given him kind of a shout out here in the book, which is true. But it's worth looking at the poem to kind of figure out why this poem is put in this particular place. So based on all of the things that Victor has been thinking about at this point, right before the poem begins, he says, "Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute meaning nature? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might nearly be free." So if all we had to deal with was, being like an animal, the things that found in nature, we could be free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows and a chance word or scene that a word may convey to us. So he's kind of lamenting, being a human. If we look at the poem in its entirety, the part that Mary Shelley chooses to include is the second half of the poem, which would be the third and fourth stanzas. So the first part of the poem kind of sets an overall tone. We are as clouds that veil the midnight moon, how restlessly they speed and gleam and quiver, streaking the darkness radiantly, yet soon night closes round and they are lost forever. So even if you're scratching your head, you can tell that this is kind of a sad poem, right? Things that are lost forever. We begin with an opening simile comparing people to clouds. Now, if you start to think about this, it's aligning us with nature, but it's also talking about where the clouds that cover up the moon, the light of the moon. All right, these restless things that streak across the darkness, but then are gone. All right, so it's about how maybe like ephemeral life is. The second stanza, we're compared to lyres or those stringed harp-like instruments. The poem continues, "Are forgotten lyres whose dissonant strings give various response to each varying blast, to whose frail frame no second motion brings one mood or modulation like the last." So again, we have a comparison here, and here the comparison kind of is to something man-made, but it's again about the sound that comes from a string. So something else that is very ephemeral or not long lasting. Oh, Boomer, get out of here. Sorry, I have two dogs. And so being compared to the music is something that is not long lasting. And the response, sorry. Anyway, um, so this comparison that things don't last, and again, it's not kind of in a good way. It's seen as a as a bad thing almost, right? So we're these sounds that can't last forever, and we're all different. So the part that Shelley chooses to use in this chapter are actually the final two, and we have a shift because we lose these comparisons, and we have this parallel structure that begins. We rest. A dream has the power to poison sleep. We rise. One wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel, conceive or reason, laugh or weep, embrace fond woe, or cast our cares away. So it gives us all of these little either or situations, but essentially, as people, we're not musical instruments, we're not clouds, but we're people. And because we are human, we have emotions that can be disrupted, that can easily change. A dream can quickly poison your sleep. One silly thought can quickly change your day. And all of these other things, laughing, weeping, they can change so quickly, and that has an effect overall on our life and our perception of our lives. It ends by saying, it is the same. So, this very kind of vague pronoun. What is the same? Joy or sorrow? It's the same. The path of its departure is still free. Man's yesterday may never be like tomorrow. Nothing may endure but mutability. And the definition of mutability is the ability to change. So essentially, here, as Frankenstein's climbing, he's wishing to be more like these animals, but he realizes he's a man. And when you're a man, you can't count on anything to remain the same. Your happiness, your joys, so these different feelings that he's experiencing climbing this mountain, he recognizes the only thing that's going to ever endure is change. So finally, it seems like it takes him forever, he reaches the top of the mountain. And he has this kind of exclamation out loud. He says, "Wandering spirits, if indeed ye wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me as your companion away from the joys of life." So the sense of accomplishment that he gets when he reaches the top of this icy peak, as soon as he says this, ironically, he sees the monster. Okay, so let me stay here, otherwise take away all my joy. Well, joy is taken because he sees the monster. And as soon as that happens, our syntax changes. The sentences get shorter, action gets quicker. And his first words to his creature, because remember, he didn't speak to him when he first created him. He says, "Devil, do you dare approach me? And do not you fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect, or rather stay that I may trample you to dust. And oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims who you have so diabolically murdered." So he verbally attacks him and he actually threatens him. This is the first thing that he says to his monster. So those word choices of devil, vile, insect, really kind of unfair to this guy, even though, yeah, he did kill his family. But I want you to note the difference for Victor, who's supposed to be the logical one, and in this romantic book, here he's completely overcome by his feelings and his emotions, and the monster actually turns out to be the one with more sound reasoning. The monster responds to him, which is surprising because when he was created, he didn't know how to speak, he didn't know how to do anything. So he's very eloquent. He says, "I expected this reception. All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us." So he reminds him of their connection and the responsibility that Victor has to him. "You propose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life?" So calling him out, "You already created me from nothing, and now you want to kill me? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." So he answers a threat with a threat of his own, but his seems much more logical. "You owe me this, I have some conditions," and it turns out that the conditions that he has are actually just for Victor to listen to him. On the top of page 70 in the book, uh, we get finally some light shed on this whole idea of the monster being this modern Prometheus, or sorry, Victor being the modern Prometheus, and back to the epigraph, which is from Paradise Lost. The monster says, "Remember that I am thy creature, I am yours. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel." So, this allusion to Paradise Lost kind of compares Victor to God. I should be like your Adam, right? You created me, the first one of my kind, but rather I'm the fallen angel, which is saying that instead of looking at me like God looked at Adam and giving him all the things that Adam got, instead he aligns himself with Lucifer, all right, the angel that fell from heaven down into hell, and the rest of that illusion. Okay, so he from this basically just says, you need to listen to me. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would with satisfied conscience destroy your own creature. Praise the eternal justice of man. So essentially he wants him to sit there and listen to him, and this chapter ends kind of that first part of the frame story, because from chapter 11 onward for a little bit, it's going to be the monster's chance to say what he has been doing for that time. So, some things to think about in this section. Chapter 10 is probably the most significant. Is I would keep in mind the biblical allusions to Adam and his creator, the modern Prometheus, and I'm going to leave you with the question, how is Victor like the monster? So, even though obviously the monster is made of all of these different body parts, how do we see that the monster actually is like Victor, or that Victor himself is a monster? Who is the real monster here is one of these like deep thinking questions often associated with this book. And getting back to the secondary title of the book, The Modern Prometheus, I would ask you to consider, why would Shelley call the book this? Well, remember that Prometheus went against the laws of nature or of God, which is when he was refused. Zeus said, don't give them fire to mankind. And he went against that, and he was punished for it slowly and painfully. He had his liver eaten out by a bird every day as he was chained to a mountain. So is Victor the modern Prometheus? Is he the one that is going to be punished slowly and painfully for acting against nature, against God? Prometheus was the creator of mankind. Thus, he is responsible for their actions. So if they misuse the fire, that's on him, not on them. As far as Victor being Prometheus, has he stolen something from God or from the gods? And what is the purpose of this? So if you say he steals the ability to bestow life upon other people, what purpose? Was it for the good of mankind, or was it because he just really wanted to make a name for himself? All right, a couple other notes here. Victor has created a monster. Now, when we say that, it could be literally in terms of the monster itself, or it could be referring to he has created a monster in himself. How did his creation bring about the monster within him? And finally, at the end of this chapter, the monster speaks. Something to keep in mind as we get into this next section, and he alludes to it briefly here, is what is it that exactly has made him evil? Just like children, when he was born, even though he looked pretty disgusting, he started fresh and good. He was without sin. But the next time we see him, he has murdered a member of Victor's family. So what caused this change in him? Why did that happen? What effect? So how do you think mankind reacted to him or treated him for him to act out this way against Victor? Victor curses and blames the monster, but he created it, so essentially he's damning himself. And for those of you sophomore that remember reading Macbeth, we've got a little bit of an allusion here to Macbeth, who also damned himself. The monster's biggest complaint is the loneliness and isolation that he has experienced. And in a lot of ways, this mirrors Victor. This might even give you a little bit of foreshadowing as far as what the conditions of his request to Victor will be. And then finally, and most importantly, we've got this reference to Adam. In what ways is the monster like Adam? The loss of innocence. Who does this pertain to? Victor's the one that violated nature. William's innocence was lost. Justine's innocence was lost. Elizabeth loses hope in the world when she tells Victor all men are monsters, so her innocence is lost. And the monster's innocence had innocents murdered when Victor isolated and abandoned it, so kind of forcing him this way. So, who is the real monster here, quote unquote? So, kind of a lot to digest and think about, but hopefully, just giving you some things to consider. We'll return back to these illusions as we get into the monster's story. So, sorry if this went a little longer, and sorry for the dog interruptions and everything, but I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you for our next set of chapters.